It was a desert when they came, and they had come over 1,000 miles by wagon and horseback, and more than a few walked the whole way. They came beset by enormous physical obstacles, scornful whites and hostile Indians, and more than a few marked the trail with their graves. Still they came, but even here, they were not certain that the journey had ended, until the man who led them said, "This is the place. The place is the Great Salt Lake Valley." The man was Brigham Young, and this was his home, which he called the Beehive House.
American Lifestyle, Brigham Young's Beehive House, brought to you by Bassett Furniture Industries, world's largest manufacturer of fine furniture for every room in your home, and starring as your host, Mr. E.G. Marshall.
This handsome Greek revival house, a style so popular in 19th century New England, where Brigham Young was born, is solid and civilized. It makes it hard to comprehend what this territory was like in 1847 when Young first saw it. There was no Beehive House, no Temple Square, no thriving Salt Lake City, all of which I will tell you about. There was simply the blank and unforgiving desert. And the Beehive, it became a ubiquitous and revealing symbol of a people called Mormons and of their Moses named Brigham Young. It crowns the house. It's engraved on the doorknobs, carved into the wood. The Beehive stands for what Young demanded of himself and his followers: industry to exhaustion and unquestioning faith in God Almighty. Nothing less would have done. If the undoubting bee seems dull to a modern America, in 19th century Utah, one forgot its tedious example at the risk of perishing. To ensure survival, the Mormons could hardly have chosen a better man than Brigham Young. This was his office. From here, he molded an empire that spread at one time from the Rockies to the Pacific and from Mexico to Canada. Young was an American original, a self-made lion of spiritual and physical strength. He rendered unto God with a furious zeal and sincerity. As for Caesar, he mostly beat him at his own game. He was a shrewd and bold politician, and if you'll pardon the choice of words, he was devilishly good at business. Early on, no one seemed less suited for these formidable tasks than Brigham Young. In the great tradition, he was born in a log cabin to a Revolutionary War veteran and his wife in 1801 at Whittingham, Vermont, one of 11 children. His father was a painfully poor, hard-scrabble farmer, and his mother died when he was 14, but not before she had taught him to read and write. It's well she did. He was to have only 11 days of formal education. This is the main hallway of Beehive House. Listen. It's the original and has been announcing guests since the house was first built in 1854. And look at this. Wood painted to look like Tennessee marble. It's a feature throughout the house. The wood underneath is pine, which, as you do-it-yourselfers know, is a soft and crumbly wood and hard to work with, but it was the only kind available to the pioneers. They got it from the mountains, since in the arid valley there were no trees, not then. The clock is also original to the house. This is the downstairs parlor or sitting room. Young had his breakfast here each morning, and the family gathered here for evening prayers and meetings to discuss family problems. Sort of an early day version of group therapy. The practice has continued to this day. Once a week, an evening is set aside where each Mormon family meets to discuss its problems and relationships. In Young's case, that was no easy feat. He was to have 70 wives and 56 children. I'll tell you about that later on. The furnishings in this room are Victorian style and original, like this music box. With bird sounds. Most of the pieces were shipped by wagon from the East, like this exquisite old piano. Once a piano like this one had to be abandoned along the trail west. It was carefully wrapped in buffalo hides and buried with the spot marked. Years later, it was found and brought to Utah in perfect working condition. By 1832, Brigham Young was in his early 30s, and living in western New York State, not daring to dream of any of this. He was an obscure cabinet maker and glazier, skills that are reflected throughout Beehive House. He was married and had 2 children. That's how it was when he first heard about Joseph Smith and read the Book of Mormon. Like Brigham Young, Joseph Smith was a poor and undereducated farm boy. Both were raised in an era of feverish backwoods revival religion. But Smith was discontented with the available churches, and in 1820 declared that he had received a divine revelation. He was 14 years old. Later, he reported that an angel named Moroni had appeared to him on a hillside near his home at Palmyra, New York. That was in 1823. Moroni directed him to hidden gold plates buried in the hillside. These plates are said to have contained the religious and secular history of an ancient American civilization to whom Christ was known. With divine guidance, he said, Smith translated the golden plates into English and published the work in 1830 as the Book of Mormon. Mormon was supposedly one of the ancient American prophets and historians who had written the record contained on the golden plates. In that same year, Smith established his own church, known officially as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Hounded and ridiculed from the beginning, Smith moved his fragile sect to Kirtland, Ohio, and it was there in 1832 that he and Brigham Young first met. This is the dining room. Young entertained President Ulysses S. Grant here, and General Sherman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, all of the greats of his age who came to Salt Lake City. You like the wallpaper? It's not. These walls are hand-painted. Some of the delicacies of the day were chicken and peaches, ham and yams, and minced pie. As many as 50 minced pies were baked a day. Of course, because of their religious beliefs, no strong drinks, tea or coffee were served, and there was no tobacco. Mark Twain, who visited here, described Young in his book, Roughing It, and reported Brigham Young was a quiet, kindly, easy-mannered, dignified, soft-spoken gentleman. Twain also called Young the only absolute monarch in America. It wasn't that way back in the beginning. Young and Joseph Smith and the Mormons were forced to leave Kirtland, Ohio, after a financial scandal and continued harassment from non-Mormons, whom Mormons called Gentiles. They moved to Nauvoo, Illinois, and for a time thrived there. In Nauvoo, as prescient as he had been about Young one day leading the church, Joseph Smith prophesied his own death and the westward migration of his people to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. I'll tell you about that right after this announcement. In June of 1844, Smith was in Carthage, Illinois, in jail, accused of destroying an anti-Mormon newspaper. An angry mob gathered outside, broke into the jail, and killed Joseph Smith. Now the Mormons had a martyr, and therefore renewed purpose. Though at the time, outsiders were saying the church would languish without the dynamic Smith to lead it. The outsiders hadn't reckoned on Brigham Young. Almost immediately, Young got himself elected president of the church and beat down a challenge for leadership from a son of Smith and a few other ambitious dissidents. Increasingly, though, Nauvoo was becoming untenable. There was constant violence and repeated conflict with the Gentiles. House burnings, fights, even murders were commonplace. To survive, Young knew the Mormons would have to leave Illinois. And so they did. Not since Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt had a religious group undertaken such an arduous and historic exodus. Between the years 1847 and 1851, 30,000 Mormons made the journey west. Over 6,000 more died along the way. Imagine 1,000 miles in one of these. You feel a little sheepish, cursing rush hour traffic from your air-conditioned automobile? Young imposed a strict regime on his pioneers. A bugle sounded each morning at 5 a.m. By 7, the caravan was underway. They stopped at noon for an hour and for lunch, and at night they formed the wagons in a circle in which the livestock was enclosed. At 8:30 p.m., the bugle called each man to his wagon for prayers. At 9 o'clock, they were asleep. They had traveled an average of 8 miles a day for their pains. This room is called the Long Hall. Rightfully so. Its length is 50 feet, and it's the most elegant room in Beehive House. Brigham Young made some of the furniture in this room himself. The draperies are woven after the original design with rose lambrequin, and the chandeliers were lit with coal oil. The harp and piano are original. The carpet is decorated with arrangements of roses and leaves. The roses are important because Young had said on first seeing the valley, "We'll make the desert blossom like the rose." These beautiful gardens belie the fact that when the Mormons first arrived here, the most hostile enemy was nature herself. The famous Indian scout, Jim Bridger, who had encountered Young along the way, was dismayed when Young told him where they were headed. He said he'd give $1,000 if he knew an ear of corn could ripen in Salt Lake Valley. But as desolate as the valley seemed, it had hidden riches. The soil was excellent, and the mountains all around contained the water that would make it flourish. As soon as they arrived, Young had his men begin an irrigation project, and on the first day, they had 5 acres of potatoes planted. 1 week later, Young laid out Salt Lake City with streets 132 feet wide and reserved the central block for the temple he was determined to build. Like all enduring religions, if Mormonism had its martyrs, it also had its miracles. Fortunately, the first winter had been mild in Utah, for which the Mormons were grateful. They were more than thankful still when the spring came and the shoots of their first planting sprouted. But the rejoicing was short-lived. The mild winter also had produced hundreds of thousands of hungry crickets that attacked the ripening crops. The Mormons beat the air with their shovels, built fires, and dug trenches around their grain, but nothing worked. Still, the crickets came to devour the precious planting. They blacked out the sun and threatened starvation. The Latter-day Saints, in desperation, prayed to God for relief. Then the seagulls came from the desert. From the islands in the Great Salt Lake, they flew in by the thousands and gorged themselves on the hungry crickets. This bizarre feast went on for days, till finally the insects were devoured and the tender stalks of grain were saved. That's why there's this monument to seagulls in Temple Square, and why there was a stiff fine for harming one. There's another statue on Temple Square. It's dedicated to those Mormons who literally walked their way to Utah. By the 1850s, there were so many Mormons wanting to make their way to the Promised Land that the church could not afford to outfit them all with wagons and oxen or horses. These hand carts were devised as a substitute. Over 3,000 people came to Utah this way. They didn't call it Utah then. It was called Deseret. This had been Mexican territory when the Mormons arrived. Young built the telegraph lines across the territory and contracted to build much of the railway that finally sealed the West to the United States. Even so, he was condemned by a large segment of the American population. Polygamy, or plural marriage, was the reason, and almost the unraveling of his empire. Our government even sent an army to unseat him. I'll tell you about all of that right after this announcement. This is the kitchen of Beehive House. It was a busy place. According to Clarissa Young, 51st child of Brigham Young, the chief cook here was her mother, Lucy Decker Young, who became the first plural wife of Brigham Young in June 1842. In shifts, Lucy Decker Young served 7 meals a day from here. Too many of us, I'm afraid, think, when we think of the Mormons, only about polygamy, or the practice of a man having more than one wife. The idea for polygamy came in Nauvoo, Illinois, as divine revelation to the prophet Joseph Smith. Again, according to the memoirs of his daughter Clarissa, Brigham Young did not take easily to this new demand on his faith. Following the death of his first wife, Young had married Mary Ann Angel, whose brother, incidentally, was the architect of Beehive House. Clarissa reports that polygamy was a great trial to her father and Mary Ann Angel. At the funeral of a friend, he is reported to have envied the dead. Finally, however, they accepted the principle, and all of Brigham Young's marriages took place with the full approval of Mary Ann, who became known as Mother Young. It's documented that Brigham Young had 70 wives. Not all were real marriages, nor did all the wives live in Beehive House. Some of his wives were wedded to him in spirit only, for a rather complicated afterlife that Mormons believe in. Some of the wives were scattered around the state and town. The rest did live here or next door in Lyon House. Young sired 56 children. This is the store at Beehive House. Doesn't everybody have one? The store is a novel idea and a practical one, given Young's situation. Each of his wives had an account here, and all were treated equally by John Haslam, whom Young had hired to manage it. The wives and children got their staples here, and the calicos and yarn and drugs and notions. Fancier items were available at the Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, where they also had accounts. The ZCMI is a department store that Young established for the Mormons that exists to this day. As you might imagine, Young's power created powerful enemies in Washington, and they used polygamy as a reason to try and destroy him. Young and the Saints had been abrupt, even brutal, with all the federal officials in the territory. He trusted none so much as himself. If he held these prejudicial suspicions, remember, he had been taught some bitter lessons by the Gentiles. President James Buchanan sent an army to occupy the territory in 1857 in an episode called the Utah War. Actually, a war never took place, just a very nervous confrontation. The so-called war, which was proving costly and embarrassing to Washington, ended quickly when intermediaries worked out an agreement whereby the troops could march through Salt Lake City, thus symbolically taking it for the government, so long as they did not encamp there. They didn't, and everybody's face was saved, and the war was over. There were great and fruitful years still ahead for Brigham Young, but the ending of the Civil War and the coming of the railroad, which he did so much to build, were crumbling Utah's isolation and weakening Young's absolute hold on the territory. There was a strong sentiment growing for statehood. I'll be back to tell you about it, and we'll see the great Tabernacle and hear its superb choir after this announcement. For all of his rough courage and manners and the time-crushing burdens of holding together his people to build Deseret, Young had great love and sensitivity for the arts and gave them considerable time and energy. He loved architecture and fine furnishings, as we've seen. He also loved the theater and music. P.T. Barnum also came to Salt Lake City and brought Tom Thumb and his wife with him. Young jokingly asked Barnum, "What will you give to exhibit me in New York and the eastern cities?" "Well, Mr. President," Barnum seriously replied, "I'll give you half the receipts, which I will guarantee shall be $200,000, for I consider you to be the best show in America." This is the Mormon Tabernacle, one of the most unusual buildings anywhere. It's 150 feet wide, 250 feet long, and will seat almost 9,000 people. The building rests on 12 sandstone buttresses. Everything else is made entirely of wood. The great pipe organ is also made entirely of wood, knotless white pine from 300 miles south of Salt Lake City. I told you Brigham Young loved music. Well, indeed he did. "We can't preach the gospel unless we have good music," he once said. And the Mormons have good music, great music, in the famed Salt Lake Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Founded in 1847, today it's a world-famous organization of 375 voices. This is the Mother Temple of the Latter-day Saints. The architect was Truman Angell, but the vision that inspired it was Brigham Young's. 4 days after arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, he marked the spot where it should be built by striking the point of his cane into the earth and proclaiming, "Here we will build the temple of our God." Unfortunately, he did not live to see it finished. It has 6 towers, the tallest rising 210 feet. That is the angel Moroni on top, gilded with pure gold leaf. The foundation is 16 feet thick and 16 feet deep. The basement walls are 9 feet thick, and the upper walls are 6 feet thick. Brigham Young was building for the ages. I'd take you inside, but only members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are allowed inside the Holy Temple. I'll be right back after this announcement. This is Brigham Young's bedroom on the first floor of Beehive House. This hat and cane belong to him. See, embossed inside, President Brigham Young. Young was a powerful speaker, and it is reported that to emphasize his points, he'd often whack the pulpit with his cane. There are nicks here to attest to the story. At this cherrywood desk, or secretary, as it was called, Brigham Young did much of the work and determined the fate of the Latter-day Saints, and I'm sure pondered the long, turbulent journey of his life. Brigham Young died here in 1877 at age 76. At the end, it is reported his last words were, said 4 times over, Joseph, 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 Joseph. Here, a short distance from Beehive House, Brigham Young lies buried. It's a modest memorial. Brigham Young, prophet, statesman, pioneer. What about this fierce and bumptious leader of the Latter-day Saints? Well, even his worst enemies, and his enemies were legion, could not deny that he had a genius for command and business, and a powerful character fired by courage and an unyielding tenacity. If at times he was violent and dictatorial, he could also be benevolent and visionary. He outlasted every inclemency. His city of Salt Lake has nearly 500,000 people in a spacious and prosperous community. He and his people have made a valuable and lasting contribution to American life. And in the softer times such as ours, not the least of his legacy is the lesson of the Beehive.
American Lifestyle, Brigham Young's Beehive House, brought to you by Bassett Furniture Industries and the more than 20,000 Bassett dealers throughout the country, with your host, Mr. E.G. Marshall.